Hey there, everybody. So, for personal news, turns out my car is basically in a coma. So, I'm gonna be buying a new one. I am lucky that I can afford it. It's just going to be unpleasant for a bit. So, hmm, we're gonna see if we can get it fixed up and hand it off to my niece or nephew. And well, in the meantime, I've got a book for you. So. The nothingness was only inch thick after all. Beyond it, in a gray, drizzling evening, was a cement path down to a garden gate. Howl and Michael were waiting at the gate. Beyond that was a flat, hard-looking road lined with houses on both sides. Sophie looked back at where she had come from, shivering rather in the drizzle, and found that the castle had become a house of yellow brick with large windows. Like all the other houses, it was square and new, with a front door of wobbly glass. Nobody seemed to be out about among the houses. That may have been to do with the drizzle, but Sophie had a feeling that it was really because, in spite of there being so many houses, this was somewhere at the edge of town. When you're quite finished nosing, Howell called. His gray and scarlet finery was all misted with drizzle. He was dangling a bunch of strange keys, most of which were flat and yellow and seemed to match the houses. When Sophie came down to the path, he said, "We need to be dressed in keeping with this place." His finery blurred, as if the drizzle round him had suddenly become a fog. When it came into focus again, it was still scarlet and gray, but quite a different shape. The dangling sleeves had gone, and the whole outfit was baggier. It looked worn and shabby. Michael's jacket had become a waist-length padded thing. He lifted his foot with a canvas shoe on it, and stared at the tight blue things encasing his legs. "I can hardly bend a knee," he said. "You get used to it," said Howl. "Come on, Sophie." To Sophie's surprise, Howl led the way back up the garden path towards the yellow house. The back of his baggy jacket, she saw, had mysterious words on it. Wilsh Rugby. Michael followed Howl, walking in a kind of tight strut because of the things on his legs. Sophie looked down at herself and saw twice as much skinny leg showing above her knobby shoes. Otherwise, not much about her had actually changed. Howl unlocked the wavy glass door with one of his keys. It had a wooden notice hanging beside it on chains. Rivendell, Sophie read as Howl pushed her into a neat, shiny hall space. I need a tissue. Sorry about that. There seemed to be people in the house. Loud voices were coming from behind the nearest door. When Howl opened that door, Sophie realized that the voices were coming from a magic-colored pictures moving on the front of a big square box. "Howl!" exclaimed a woman who was sitting there knitting. She put down her knitting, looking a little annoyed, but before she could get up... Oh, sorry. "Howl!" exclaimed a woman who was sitting there knitting. She put down her knitting, looking up a little annoyed, but before she could get up, a small girl who had been watching the magic picture very seriously, with her chin in her hands, leapt up and flung herself at Howl. "Uncle Howl!" she screamed, and jumped halfway up Howl with her legs wrapped around him. "Mary!" Howl bawled in reply. "How are you, Cariad? Been a good girl, then?" He and the little girl broke into a foreign language then, fast and loud, so if he could see that they were very special to one another. She wondered about the language. It sounded the same as Calcifer's silly saucepan song, but it was hard to be sure. In between bursts of foreign chatter, Howl managed to say, as if he were a ventriloquist, "This is my niece Mary, and this is my sister Megan Parry. Megan, this is Michael Fisher, and Sophie..." "Hatter," said Sophie. Megan shook hands with both of them in a restrained, disapproving way. She was older than Howl, but quite like him, with the same long, angular face, but her eyes were blue and full of anxieties, and her hair was darkish. "Quiet now, Mary," she said, in a voice that cut through the foreign chatter. Howl, are you staying long? Oh, just popped in for a moment, Howl said, lowering Mary to the floor. Gareth isn't in yet, Megan said, in a meaning sort of way. Oh, what a pity. We can't stay, Howl said, smiling a warm, false smile. I just thought I'd introduce you to my friends here, and I want to ask you something that may sound silly. Has Neil, by any chance, lost a piece of English homework lately? Funny you should say that, Megan exclaimed. Looking everywhere for it, he has. Last Thursday, he's got this new English teacher, see, and she's very strict. Doesn't just worry about the spelling either. Puts the fear of God into them about getting work done on time. Doesn't do Neil any harm, lazy little devil. Here he is on Thursday, hunting high and low, and all he can find is a funny piece of old writing. Ah, said Howl. What did he do with that writing? I told him to hand it in to Miss Angorian of his. Might show her he tried for once. And did he? Howl asked. I don't know. Better ask Neil. He's up in the front bedroom with that machine of his, said Megan. But you don't get a world of sense out of him. Come on, Howl said to Michael and Sophie, who were both staring round the shiny brown and orange room. He took Mary's hand and led them all out of the room and up the stairs. Even those had a carpet, a pink and green one, so the procession led by Howl made hardly any noise as it went along the pink and green passage upstairs and into a room with blue and yellow carpet. But Sophie was not sure that the two boys crouched over the various magic boxes on a big table by the window would have looked up even for an army with a brass band. The main magic box had a glass front like the one downstairs, but it seemed to be showing writing and diagrams more than pictures. All the boxes grew on long, floppy white stalks that appeared to be rooted into the wall of one side of the room. Neil, said Howl. Don't interrupt, one of the boys said. He'll lose his life. Seeing as it was a matter of life and death, Sophie and Michael backed towards the door, but Howl, quite unperturbed at killing his nephew, strode over to the wall and pulled the box up by the roots. The picture on the box vanished. Both boys said words which Sophie did not think even Martha knew. The second boy spun round, shouting, Mary, I'll get you for that. It wasn't me, so, Mary shouted back. Neil whirled further round and stared accusingly at Howl. How do you do, Neil? Howl said pleasantly. Who's he? Said the other boy asked. My no-good uncle, Neil said. He glowered at Howl. He was dark, with thick eyebrows, and his glower was most impressive. What do you want? Put the plug back in. There's a welcome in the valleys, said Howl. I'll put it back in when I've asked you something and you've answered. Neil sighed. Uncle Howl, I'm in the middle of a computer game. A new one? Asked Howl. Both the boys looked discontented. No, it's the one I had for Christmas, Neil said. You ought to know the way they go on about wasting time and money on useless things. They won't give me another till my birthday. Oh, then that's easy, said Howl. You won't mind stopping if you've done it before, and I'll bribe you with a new one. Really? Both boys said eagerly, and Neil added, Can you make it another one of those nobody else has got? Yes, but take a look at this first and tell me what it is, Howl said, and then he held up the shiny gray paper in front of Neil. Both boys looked at it. Neil said, It's a poem. In in the way that most people would say, it's a dead rat. It's the one Miss Angorian set for last week's homework, said the other boy. I remember Wind and Finned. It's about submarines. While Sophie and Michael blinked at this new theory, wondering how they'd missed it, Neil exclaimed, Hey, it's me long-lost homework. Where'd you find it? Was that funny writing that turned up yours? Miss Angorian said it was interesting. Lucky for me, she took it home with her. Ah, thank you, said Howl. Now where does she live? That flat over Mrs. Phillips' tea shop. Cardiff Road, said Neil. When will you give me the new tape? When you remember how the rest of the poem goes, said Howl. That's not fair, said Neil. I can't even remember the bit that was written down now. That's just playing with a person's feelings. He stopped when Howl laughed, felt in one baggy pocket, and handed him a flat packet. Thanks, Neil said devoutly, and without much more ado, he whirled round to his magic boxes. Howl planted the bundle of roots back in the wall, grinning, and beckoned Michael and Sophie out of the room. Both boys began a flurry of mysterious activity, into which Mary somehow squeezed herself, watching with her thumb in her mouth. Howl hurried away to the pink and green stairs, but Michael and Sophie both hung about near the door to the room and wondered what the whole thing was about. Inside, Neil was reading aloud. You're in an enchanted castle with 4 doors. Each opens into a different dimension. The dimension one, in dimension one, the castle is moving constantly and may arrive at hazard any time. Sophie wondered at the familiarity of this as she hobbled down the stairs. She found Michael standing halfway down, looking embarrassed. Howl was at the foot of the stairs, having an argument with his sister. "What do you mean you sold all my books?" she heard Howl saying. I needed one of them particularly. They weren't yours to sell." "Ah, don't keep interrupting," Megan answered, in a low, ferocious voice. "Listen now, I have told you before, I'm not a storehouse for your property. You're a disgrace to me and Gareth, lounging about in those clothes instead of buying a proper suit, and looking respectable for once, taking up with riffraff and layabouts, and bringing them into your house. Are you trying to bring me down to your level? You've had all that education and you don't even get a decent job. You just hang around wasting all that time at college, wasting all those sacrifices other people have made, wasting your money." Megan would have been a match for Mrs. Fairfax. Her voice went on and on. Sophie began to understand how Howl had acquired the habit of slithering out. Megan was the kind of person who made you want to back quietly out of the nearest door. Unfortunately, Howl was backed up against the stairs, and Sophie and Michael were bottled up behind him. "Never doing an honest day's work, never getting a job I could be proud of, bringing shame on me and Gareth, coming here and spoiling Mary rotten." Mary ground on remorselessly. Sophie pushed Michael aside and stumped downstairs, looking as stately as she could manage. "Come, Howl," she said grandly. "We really must be on our way. While we stand here, money is ticking away and your servants are probably selling the gold plate." "So nice to meet you," she said to Megan as she arrived at the foot of the stairs. "But we must rush. Howl is a busy man." Megan gulped a bit and stared at Sophie. Sophie gave her a stately nod and pushed Howl towards the wavy glass front door. Michael's face was bright red. Sophie saw that because Howl turned back to ask Megan, "Is my old car in the shed, or have you sold that too?" "Ah, you've got the only set of keys," Megan answered dourly. That seemed to be the only goodbye. The front door slammed, and Howl took them back to a square white building at the end of the flat brick road. Howl did not say anything about Megan. He said, as he unlocked a wide door in the building, "I suppose the fierce English teacher is bound to have a copy of that book." Sophie wished to forget the next bit. They rode down in a carriage without horses that went at a terrifying speed, smelling and growling and shaking as it tore down some of the steepest roads that Sophie had ever seen. Roads so steep that she wondered why the houses lining them did not slide into a heap at the bottom. She shut her eyes and clung to some of the pieces that had torn off the seats and simply hoped that it would be over soon. But luckily, it was. They arrived in a flatter road with houses crammed in on both sides, beside a large window filled with a white curtain and a notice that said, "Tea's closed." But beside this forbidding notice, when Howl pressed a button at a small door beside the window, Miss Angorian opened the door. They all stared at her. For a fierce schoolteacher, Miss Angorian was astonishingly young and slender and good-looking. She had sheets of blue-black hair hanging round her olive-brown, heart-shaped face and enormous black eyes. The only thing which suggested fierceness about her was the direct and clever way those enormous eyes looked and seemed to sum them up. "I'll take a small guess that you may be Howl Jenkins," Miss Angorian said to Howl. She had a low, melodious voice that was nevertheless rather amused and quite sure of itself. Howl was taken aback for an instant. Then his smile snapped on, and that, Sophie thought, was goodbye to the pleasant dreams of Letty and Mrs. Fairfax. For Miss Angorian was exactly the kind of lady that someone like Howl could be trusted to fall in love with on the spot. And not only Howl, Michael was staring admiringly too, and though all the houses around were apparently deserted, Sophie had no doubt that they were full of people who all knew both Howl and Miss Angorian, and were watching with interest to see what would happen. She could feel the invisible eyes. Market Chipping was like that too. "And you must be Miss Angorian," said Howl. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I made a stupid mistake last week and carried off my nephew's English homework instead of a rather important paper that I had with me. I gather Neil gave it to you as proof that he wasn't shirking." "He did," said Miss Angorian. "You'd better come in and collect it." Sophie was sure that the invisible eyes in all of the houses goggled and the invisible necks craned as Howl and Michael and she trooped in through Miss Angorian's door and up a flight of stairs to Miss Angorian's tiny, severe living room. Miss Angorian said, considerately to Sophie, Won't you sit down? Sophie was still shaking from that horse's carriage. She sat down gladly on one of the two chairs. It was not very comfortable. Miss Angorian's room was not designed for comfort, but for study. Though many of the things in it were strange, Sophie understood the walls of books, and the piles of paper on the table, and the folders stacked on the floor. She sat and watched Michael staring sheepishly, and Howl turning on his charm. "How is it you come to know who I am?" Howl asked, beguilingly. "You seem to have caused a lot of gossip in this town," Miss Angorian said, busy sorting through papers on the table. "And what have those people who gossip told you?" Howl asked. He leaned languishingly on the side of the table and tried to catch Miss Angorian's eye. "That you disappear and turn up rather unpredictably, for one thing," Miss Angorian said. "And what else?" Howl followed Miss Angorian's movements with such a look that Sophie knew Letty's only chance was for Miss Angorian to fall instantly in love with Howl too. But Miss Angorian was not that kind of lady. She said many other things, few of them to your credit, and caused Michael to blush by looking at him and then at Sophie in a way that suggested that these things were not fit for their ears. She held a yellowish, wavy-edged paper out to Howl. "Here it is," she said severely. "Do you know what it is?" "Of course," said Howl. "Then please, tell me," said Miss Angorian. Howl took the paper. There was a bit of scruffle as he tried to take Miss Angorian's hand with it. Miss Angorian won the scruffle, and put her hands behind her back. Howl smiled meltingly and passed the paper on to Michael. "You tell her," he said. Michael's blushing face lit up as soon as he looked at it. "It's the spell! Oh, I can do this one! It's an enlargement, isn't it?" "That's what I thought," Miss Angorian said, rather accusingly. "I'd like to know what you were doing with such a thing." "Oh, Miss Angorian," said Howl, "if you've heard all those things about me, you must know that I wrote my doctoral thesis on charms and spells. You look as if you suspect me of working black magic. I assure you I never worked any kind of spell in my life." Sophie could not stop herself making a small snort at this blatant lie. "With my hand on my heart," Howl added, giving Sophie an irritated frown. "This spell is for study purposes only. It's very old and very rare. That's why I wanted it back." "Well, you have it back," Miss Angorian said briskly. "Before you go, would you mind giving me my homework sheet in return? Photocopies cost money." Howl brought out the gray paper willingly and held it just out of reach. "This poem now," he said. "It's been bothering me. Silly, really, but I can't remember the rest of it. Walter Raleigh, isn't it?" Miss Angorian gave him a withering look. "Certainly not. It's John Donne, and it's very well known indeed. I have the book with it in here, if you want to refresh your memory." "Oh, please," said Howl, and from the way his eyes followed Miss Angorian as she went to her wall of books, Sophie realized that this was the real reason why Howl had come into this strange land where his family had lived. But Howl was not above killing two birds with one stone. "Miss Angorian," he said pleadingly, following her contours as she stretched out for the book, "would you consider coming out for some supper with me tonight?" Miss Angorian turned round with a large book in her hands, looking more severe than ever. "I would not," she said. "Mr. Jenkins, I don't know what you've heard about me, but you must have heard that I still consider myself engaged to Ben Sullivan." "Never heard of him," said Howl. "My fiancé," said Miss Angorian. "He disappeared some years back. Now, do you wish for me to read this poem out to you?" "Oh, do that," Howl said, quite unrepentant. "You have such a lovely voice." "Then I'll start with the second verse," Miss Angorian said, "since you have the first verse there in your hand." She read very well, not only melodiously, but in a way which made the second verse fit the rhythm of the first, which, in Sophie's opinion, it did not do at all. "If thou beest born to strange sights, things invisible to see, ride 10,000 days and nights, till age of snow-white hairs on thee. Thou, when thou returnest, wilt tell me all strange wonders that befell thee, and swear nowhere lives a woman true and fair. If thou—" And Howl had gone terribly white. Sophie could see sweat standing on his face. Thank you, he said. Stop there. I won't trouble you for the rest, even if the good woman is untrue in the last verse, isn't she? I remember now. Silly of me, John Donne, of course. Miss Angorian lowered the book and stared at him. He forced up a smile. We must be going now. Sure you won't change your mind about the supper? I will not, said Miss Angorian. Are you quite well, Mr. Jenkins? In the pink, Howl said, and he hustled Michael and Sophie away down the stairs and into the horrible horseless carriage. The invisible watchers in the houses must have thought Miss Angorian was chasing them with a saber if they judged from the speed with which Howl packed them in and drove off. What's the matter? Michael asked as the carriage went roaring and grinding uphill again, and Sophie clung to bits of seat for her dear life. Howl pretended not to hear. So Michael waited until Howl was locking it into his shed and asked again. Oh, nothing, Howl said airily, leading away back to the yellow house called Rivendell. The Witch of the Waste has caught up with me with her curse, that's all. Bound to happen sooner or later. He seemed to be calculating or doing sums in his head while he opened the garden gate. 10,000, Sophie heard him murmur. That brings about Midsummer's Day. What is brought to Midsummer's Day? She asked Sophie. The time I will be 10,000 days old, Howl said. And that, Mrs. Nose, he said, swinging into the garden of Rivendell, is the day I shall have to go back to the Witch of the Waste. Sophie and Michael hung back on the path, staring at Howl's back, so mysteriously labeled Wheel Shrewsbury. If I keep clear of mermaids, they heard him mutter, and don't touch a mandrake root. Michael called out, Do we have to go back into that house? Sophie called. And Sophie called, What will the witch do? I shudder to think, Howl said. You don't have to go back in, Michael. So he opened the wavy glass door, and inside was the familiar room of the castle. Calcifer's sleepy flames were coloring the walls, faintly blue-green in the dusk. Howl flung back his long sleeves and gave Calcifer a log. She caught up, old Blueface, he said. I know, said Calcifer. I felt it take. Chapter 12, in which Sophie becomes Howl's old mother. Sophie did not see much point in blackening Howl's name to the king, now that the witch had caught up with him, but Howl said it was more important than ever. I shall need everything I've got just to escape the witch, he said. I can't have the king after me as well. So the following afternoon, Sophie put on her new clothes and sat feeling very fine, if rather stiff, waiting for Michael to get ready and for Howl to finish in the bathroom. While she waited, she told Calcifer about the strange country where Howl's family lived. It took her mind off the king. Calcifer was very impressed. I knew he came from foreign parts, he said, but this sounds like another world. Clever of the witch to send a curse in from there. Very clever all around. That's magic I admire. Using something that exists anyway and turning it round into a curse. I did wonder about it when you and Michael were reading it the other day. That fool Howl told her too much about himself. Sophie gazed at Calcifer's thin blue face. It did not surprise her to find that Calcifer admired the curse, any more than it surprised her that he had called Howl a fool. He was always insulting Howl, but she never could work out if Calcifer really hated Howl. Calcifer looked so evil anyway that it was hard to tell. Calcifer moved his orange eyes to look into Sophie's. I'm scared too, he said. I shall suffer with Howl if the witch catches him. If you don't break the contract before she does, I won't be able to help you at all. Before Sophie could ask more, Howl came dashing out of the bathroom looking his very finest, scenting the room with roses and yelling for Michael. Michael clattered downstairs in his new blue velvet. Sophie stood up and collected her trusty stick. It was time to go. Oh, you look wonderfully rich and stately, Michael said to her. Oh, she does me credit, said Howl, apart from that awful old stick. Some people, said Sophie, are thoroughly self-centered. This stick goes with me. I need it for moral support. Howl looked at the ceiling. But he did not argue. They took their stately way into the streets of Kingsbury. Sophie, of course, looked back to see what the castle was like there. She saw a big, arched gateway surrounding a small black door. The rest of the castle seemed to be a blank stretch of plastered wall between two carved stone houses. Before you ask, said Howl, it's really just a disused stable. This way. They walked through the streets, looking at least as fine as any of the passers-by. Not that many people were about. Kingsbury was a long way south, and it was a bakingly hot day there. The pavements shimmered. Sophie discovered that another disadvantage of being old: you felt queer in hot weather. The elaborate buildings wavered in front of her eyes. She was annoyed because she wanted to take a look at the place, but all she had was a dim impression of golden domes and tall houses. "By the way," Howl said, "Mrs. Pensman will call you Mrs. Pendragon. Pendragon's the name I go under here." "Whatever for?" said Sophie. "For disguise," said Howl. "Pendragon's a lovely name, much better than Jenkins." "I get by quite well with a plain name," Sophie said, as they turned into a blessedly narrow and cool street. "We can't all be Mad Hatters," said Howl. Mrs. Pensman's house was gracious and tall, near the end of the narrow street. It had orange trees in tubs on either side of its handsome front door. This door was opened by an elderly footman in black velvet who led them into a wonderfully cool, black and white checkered marble hall, where Michael tried secretly to wipe sweat off his face. Howl, who always seemed to be cool, treated the footman as an old friend and made jokes to him. The footman passed them on to a page boy in red velvet. Sophie, as the boy led them ceremoniously up polished stairs, began to see why this made good practice for meeting the king. She felt as if she were in a palace already. When the boy ushered them into a shaded drawing room, she was sure even a palace could not be this elegant. Everything in this room was blue and gold and white, and small and fine. Mrs. Pensman was the finest of all. She was tall and thin. She sat bolt upright, in a blue and gold embroidered chair, supporting herself rigidly with one hand, in a gold mesh mitten on a gold-topped cane. She wore old gold silk, in a very stiff and old-fashioned style, finished off with an old gold headdress not unlike a crown, which tied in an old gold bow beneath her gaunt eagle face. She was the finest and most frightening lady that Sophie had ever seen. "Ah, my dear Howl," she said, holding out a gold mesh mitten. Howl bent and kissed the mitten, as he was obviously supposed to do. He did it very gracefully, but it was rather spoiled from the back view by Howl flapping his other hand furiously at Michael behind his back. Michael, a little too slowly, realized that he was supposed to stand by the door beside the page boy. He backed there in a hurry, only too pleased to get as far away from Mrs. Pensman as he could. "Mrs. Pensman, allow me to present my dear old mother," Howl said, waving his hand at Sophie. Since Sophie felt just like Michael, Howl had to flap his hand at her, too. "Charmed, delighted," said Mrs. Pensman, and she held her gold mitten out to Sophie. Sophie was not sure if Mrs. Pensman meant for her to kiss the mitten as well, but she could not bring herself to try. She laid her own hand on the mitten instead. The hand under it felt quite old, like an cold claw. After feeling it, Sophie was quite surprised that Mrs. Pensman was alive. "Forgive my not standing up, Mrs. Pendragon," Mrs. Pensman said. "My health is not good. It forced me to retire from teaching 3 years ago. Pray, sit down, both of you." Trying not to shake with nerves, Sophie sat grandly in the embroidered chair opposite Mrs. Pensman's, supporting herself on her stick in what she hoped was the same elegant way. Howl spread himself gracefully in a chair next to him. He looked quite at home, and Sophie envied him. "I am 86, Mrs. Pensman announced. "How old are you, my dear Mrs. Pendragon?" 90, Sophie said, that being the first high number that came into her head. "So old," Mrs. Pensman said, with what may have been slight, stately envy. "How lucky you are to be able to move so nimbly still." "Oh, yes, she's so wonderfully nimble that sometimes there's no stopping her," Howl agreed. Mrs. Pensman gave him a look which told Sophie that she had been a teacher at least as fierce as Miss Angorian. "I am talking to your mother," she said. "I dare say that she is as proud of you as I am. We are 2 old ladies who both had a hand in forming you. You are, one might say, our joint creation." Don't you think I put any of me myself then? Put in just a few touches of my own? A few, and those not altogether to my liking, Mrs. Pensman replied. But you will not wish to sit here and hear yourself being discussed. You will go down and sit on the terrace, taking your page boy with you, where Hunch will bring you both a cool drink. Go along. If Sophie had not been so nervous herself, she might have laughed at the expression on Howl's face. He had obviously not expected this to happen at all, but he got up with only a slight shrug, made a slight warning face at Sophie, and shooed Michael out of the room ahead of him. Mrs. Pensman turned her rigid body very slightly to watch them go. Then she nodded at the page boy, who scuttled out of the room too. After that, Mrs. Pensman turned herself back toward Sophie, and Sophie felt more nervous than ever. I prefer him with the black hair, Mrs. Pensman announced. The boy is going to be bad. Or is going to the bad. Who, Michael? Sophie said, bewildered. No, not the servitor, said Mrs. Pensman. I do not think he is clever enough to cause me concern. I was talking about Howl, Mrs. Pendragon. Oh, said Sophie, wondering why Mrs. Pensman only said going. Howl had surely arrived at the bad long ago. Take his whole appearance, Mrs. Pensman said sweepingly. Look at his clothes. He is always very careful about his appearance, Sophie agreed, and wondered why she was putting it so mildly. And always was. I am careful about my appearance too, and I see no harm in that, said Mrs. Pensman. But what call has he to be walking around in a charmed suit? It is a dazzling attraction charm, directed at the ladies, and very well done, I must admit, and barely detectable even to my trained eye, since it appears to have darned into the seams, and one which will render him almost irresistible to ladies. This represents a downward trend into black arts, which must surely cause you some motherly concern, Mrs. Pendragon. Sophie thought uneasily about the gray and scarlet suit. She had darned the seams without noticing it had anything particular about it. But Mrs. Pensman was an expert on magic, and Sophie was only an expert on clothes. Mrs. Pensman put both gold mittens on top of her stick, and canted her stiff body so that both of her trained and piercing eyes stared into Sophie's. Sophie felt more nervous and uneasy. My life is nearly over, Mrs. Pensman announced. I have felt death tiptoeing close for some time now. Oh, I'm quite sure that isn't so, Sophie said, trying to sound soothing. It was hard to sound like anything with Mrs. Pensman staring at her like that. I assure you it is so, said Mrs. Pensman. This is why I was anxious to see you, Mrs. Pendragon. Howl, you see, was my last pupil, and by far my best. I was about to retire when he came to me from out of that foreign land. I thought my work was done when I trained Benjamin Sullivan, who you probably know as the great wizard Suleiman, rest his soul, and I procured him the post of royal magician. Oddly enough, he came from the same country as Howl. Then Howl came, and I saw at a glance that he had twice the imagination and twice more the ability, and though I admit he had some faults of character, I knew that he was a force for good. Good, Mrs. Pendragon, but what is he now? Ah, what indeed, Sophie said. Something has happened to him, Mrs. Pensman said. Well, somebody's blasting radio, so let me close the door. I am sorry that I must deprive you of the crickets. What indeed, Sophie said. Something has happened to him, Mrs. Pensman said, still staring piercingly at Sophie, and I am determined to put that right before I die. What do you think has happened? Sophie asked uncomfortably. I must rely on you to tell me that, said Mrs. Pensman. My feeling is that he has gone the same way as the Witch of the Waste. They tell me she was not wicked once, although I have this only on hearsay, since she is older than either of us, and keeps herself young by her arts. Howl has gifts in the same order as hers. It seems as if those of high ability cannot resist some extra dangerous stroke of cleverness, which results in a fatal flaw and begins a slow decline to evil. Do you by any chance have a clue what that might be? Calcifer's voice came into Sophie's mind, saying, The contract isn't doing either of us any good in the long run. She felt a little chilly in spite of the heat of the day blowing through the open windows of the shaded, elegant room. Yes, she said. He's made some sort of a contract with the fire demon. Mrs. Pensman's hands shook a little on her stick. That'll be it. You must break that contract, Mrs. Pendragon. I would if I knew how, Sophie said. Well, surely your maternal feelings and your own strong magic gift will tell you how, Mrs. Pensman said. I've been looking at you, Mrs. Pendragon, though you may not have noticed. Oh, I noticed, Mrs. Pensman, Sophie said. And I like your gift, said Mrs. Pensman. It brings life to things, such as that stick in your hand which you have evidently talked to the extent that it has become what a layman would call a magic wand. I think you would not find it too hard to break that contract. Yes, but I would need to know what the terms of it are, Sophie said. Did Howl tell you I was a witch? Because if he did... Oh, he did not. There's no need to be coy. You can rely on my experience to know these things, said Mrs. Pensman. Then, to Sophie's relief, she shut her eyes. It was like a strong light being turned off. I do not know, nor do I wish to know about such contracts, she said. Her cane wobbled again, as if it might be shuddering. Her mouth quirked into a line suggesting that she had unexpectedly bitten on a peppercorn. But I now see, she said, what has happened to the witch. She made a contract with a fire demon, and, over the years, that demon has taken control of her. Demons do not understand good and evil, but they can be bribed into a contract provided the human offers them something valuable, something only humans have. This prolongs the life of both human and demon, and the human gets the demon's magic power to add to her own. Mrs. Pensman opened her eyes again. That is all I can bear to say on the subject, except to advise that you find out exactly what it is that the demon got. Now I must bid you farewell. I have to rest a while. And, like magic, which it probably was, the door opened and the page boy came in to usher Sophie out of the room. Sophie was extremely glad to go. She was all but squirming with embarrassment by then. She looked back at Mrs. Pensman's rigid, upright form as the door closed and wondered if Mrs. Pensman would have made her feel this bad if she really and truly had been Howl's old mother. Sophie rather thought that she would. I take my hat off to Howl for standing her as his teacher for more than a day, she muttered to herself. Madam, said the page boy, thinking Sophie was talking to him. I said go slowly down the stairs or I can't keep up, Sophie told him. Her knees were wobbling. Young boys dash about so, she said. The page boy took her slowly and considerately down the shiny stairs. Halfway down, Sophie recovered enough from Mrs. Pensman's personality to think of some of the things that Mrs. Pensman had actually said. She said Sophie was a witch. Oddly enough, Sophie accepted this without any trouble at all. That explained the popularity of certain hats, she thought. It explained Jaden Ferrier's It possibly explained the jealousy of the Witch of the Waste, and it was as if Sophie had always known this, but she had thought it was not proper to have a magic gift because she was eldest of three. Letty had been far more sensible about such things. Then she had thought of the gray and scarlet suit, and nearly fell downstairs with dismay. She was the one who had put the charm on that. She could hear herself now murmuring to it. Built to pull in the girls, she had told it. And, of course, it did. It had charmed Letty that day in the orchard, yesterday, somewhat disguised. It must have had its secret effect on Miss Angorian, too. Oh, dear, Sophie thought. I've gone and doubled the number of hearts he'll have broken. I must get that suit off of him somehow. Howl, in that same suit, was waiting in the cool black and white hall with Michael. Michael nudged Howl in a worried way as Sophie came slowly down the stairs behind the page boy. Howl looked saddened. You seem a bit ragged, he said. I think we'd better skip seeing the king. I'll go and blacken my own name when I can make your excuses. I can say my wicked ways have made you ill. That could be true from the look of you. Sophie certainly did not wish to see the king, but she thought of what Calcifer had said. If the king commanded Howl to go into the waste, and the witch caught him, Sophie's own chance of being young again would be gone too. She shook her head. After Mrs. Pensman, she said, the king of Ingray will seem like just an ordinary person. Oof. I am quite sleepy, oh best beloved. Oh, I have had an exciting last week. Maybe I should stop and get some more ice cream on the way home. I have to. Now that I know that non-dairy ice cream is a thing, I can have ice cream again, and I finished my ice cream a couple of days ago. So, self-care sometimes involves chocolate. Anyway, you have more important things to do than listen to me. So, get some rest and do your best to become somebody that you can be proud of. And if people can hate you without knowing you, then I can love you. So, get some rest. I love you very much.